So again, this is our soil health indicator webinar series being hosted through the University of Vermont Extension um, in collaboration actually with a number of folks and organizations and funding through the USDA NRCS through a CIG grant. As folks know, this is a 4-part webinar series that's really focused on soil health indicators specifically. So we'll be talking about the various indicators of soil health that you can have evaluated on your soil. So you can see we put up a first pop-up poll if you can answer that. Before we get started, that would be great. The soil health webinar today and all the webinars will offer one CCA CEU credit, and there will be a QR code available at the end of the webinar that you can scan if you have the app on your phone and get your credit once the webinar is complete. And if for some reason you do not have access to the phone app, you can provide your name and your CCA number in the chat to Susan Brulette. All right, so again, Soil Health Indicator webinar series. It's a 4-part series starting today, and the second webinar in the series, I don't know, Lindsay, if you can change the slide because you have control of the screen. The second webinar will be tomorrow, and Dr. Joshua Faulkner will be our speaker. He'll be talking on soil physical properties and soil health indicators to measure physical properties. And then on Friday, the lucky 13th of December, Dr. Deb Neer will be joining us and talking about biological indicators. And then on Monday, December 16th, Dr. Caitlin Hicks Priest from Dartmouth College will be joining us, and she'll be talking about carbon indicators and organic matter, and focused on those indicators for soil health. So we have a great lineup of speakers that will be joining us, and we're really excited to bring this information to you. So can you go to the next slide, Lindsay? All right, so I wanted to give a little context as to why we're offering this webinar series. Now, we know there's a lot of excitement and an emphasis around soil health, soil quality, building resiliency in agriculture, and just building the overall functionality of our soils to help our farms, communities, and state and region build resiliency and protect our communities during climate. So I'm getting cut off, Susan said. On and off. I don't know. Let's see. I'm gonna bring my head closer closer to the microphone. Sorry about that. And so we've been doing a lot of work, both research-wise at the university, but also within extension, a lot of work to provide education and outreach and technical assistance to the agricultural community and those that work with the agricultural community on soil health, whether it be implementing new practices, refining current practices, evaluating soil health. There's a lot of activity. And really our inspiration for this webinar series comes twofold, really. First, I think about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, my colleagues and I started to develop these farmer soil health cohorts. So bringing together groups of farmers throughout the state of Vermont that were interested in soil health and improving soil health on their farms, to work together, to learn from each other, and again, work towards building soil health on their operations. It has been a really great experience. And there's a few photos here of the farmer members and some of us meeting with each other, talking about soil health, and learning a lot about evaluating soil health, testing for it, and probably most importantly, trying to interpret those soil health tests. And that is really one of the drivers for this webinar series. What we found and what the farmers found was that we needed to know more about these soil health tests and the indicators that were being tested for to measure soil health. And really getting a good handle on when should we monitor soil health? What should we measure for? And what does it all mean? So, although our speakers have some of that information, we know it's really a start to helping us educate ourselves around improving soil health on the farm. So, with that, I'm going to share our poll results so that everybody can see who's on the webinar. I'm going to get rid of that now. I'm going to get us started. So our first webinar in this series is getting us set up for the next three, talking about some of the basics of soil health testing, the hows and the whys. And then again, tomorrow, Friday and Monday, we're going to dig into those actual indicators. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Lindsey Ruhl, who has been leading the cohort effort and have really valued her leadership on that program, and so have the farmers and our partners. And she's joining me today to get us set up for this webinar series. So I am going to turn this over to Lindsey, I think.
Thank you for that introduction.
Right.
Yeah, so it looks like I unmuted myself successfully. So we're off to a great start. Let's see if I can advance the slides now. All right. So I'd like to start today by orienting us to what soil health is. And a bunch of definitions up here. Clearly, it's not an exhaustive list. I'm certainly not going to read over each one of them, but what I did want to show that is in a lot of soil health definitions, they emphasize the impact of soil health on sustaining life, in particular, growing plants. There are many different ways of visualizing soil health. This is a diagram that you may be familiar with, and it's one that I've used the most often. I like it because it shows that soil health is comprised of physical, biological, and chemical properties. It also displays the indicators of those properties, what we can measure. The Venn diagram approach also shows how the indicators are related to each other. That inherent soil property like texture, that is the percent sand, silt, and clay, influences the chemical and biological parts of soil health. And we'll touch on that a little bit more later. The other image here is one that a farmer soil health innovator network created together. I'm sharing it because there's a lab approach to visualizing soil health, and then there is the in-field, tangible way of experiencing soil health. One where the actual living organisms are seen and actively cycling nutrients. One where we see the impact of management and the weather on the crops grown and the animals raised. This other diagram is similar, but part of the reason why I like it is that it takes it a step further by touching on assessments like visuals and soil test scoring and relating it to soil functioning and ecosystem services. And I want to go meta here for a moment because I also like to think of soil health in layers, right? With soil fertility underpinning soil quality, which underpins soil health, which impacts soil security. And then all of these layers fall into multiple scales from the field all the way up to the global, the soil acting as a skin of the earth. They perform multiple functions and services from producing food to mitigating climate change with carbon sequestration. And everyone is affected in how we treat our soils, the soils that individuals own and those we manage in common. And lastly, there are multiple ways to measure soil. And that's part of why we're having this soil health webinar indicator series. But before we get into measuring soil health indicators, I want to touch on what soil health is not. And it's not just any one thing. It's not just the soil biology, the microbes, fungus, insects, and other life in the soil. And it's not just the physical components, the soil texture and structure, or chemical components, the fertility and pH. Because soil health is not just any one thing that can be tested to give us a full soil health picture, as we've seen in the diagrams, there are many indicators of soil health. Soil health is not a simple system. It's a complex interaction between soil properties and functions. Components and indicators do not stand alone. For example, soil texture, impacts soil color, which impacts thermodynamics, ability of the soil to heat and cool, which impacts chemical reactions in the soil, impacting fertility. The ability of the soil to heat or cool itself can also influence soil biology, which through different processes like decomposition impact soil fertility. But it's even a little bit more complicated than that. For example, if we look at this table, which displays the ability of different properties or the different mineral types that comprise soil, we see that sand, silt, and clay impact certain soil behaviors or properties differently. For example, sand has a low ability for water holding capacity, ability to store plant nutrients, and ability to supply nutrients. These are also behaviors that are influenced by organic matter, which, as it turns out, sand also has a low ability to build. I bring this up to show the complexity and interrelatedness of different parts of soil health and behaviors. That measuring soil organic matter is an indirect measurement of a soil's ability to hold water, which has flood mitigation potential, and also that organic matter is also an indirect measurement of a soil's ability to retain and supply nutrients. Soil health is also not immune to what is happening around it. Soil health can be limited or impacted by its own context. Soil characteristics, agricultural practices, and environment all impact soil health. For the example, the amount of sand, a physical property, can impact porosity, and due to the chemical composition of sand, impact fertility. Agricultural practices like tillage impacts compaction, a physical property, and bacterial fungal ratios, which is a biological property. The environment can also impact soil. For example, if soil becomes water saturated too long, as it would after a flood or prolonged rainfall, the soil microbes are impacted. Conversely, really dry conditions can increase the likelihood of wind erosion that carries away precious organic matter. I would also like to add to this diagram that soil characteristics are impacted by geology, by soil forming processes, the processes that the environment subjects the soil to that may erode parent material to create the soil or may deposit soil from flooding events. And then returning back to this concept of the soil health having its own context, by that I mean the soil health is dependent, among other things, on soil texture, that is for sand, silt, and clay. Like a good friend, we need to accept the soil for what it is, both its limitations and its potential. For example, sand cannot hold on to water very well. That's just an inherent property, something that management can't really change about how sand works. That's just sand. But this can be considered a limitation in a drier environment, or it can be considered a benefit if you're to extend your growing window in wet environments. Soil texture can also influence the potential for building organic matter. If organic matter is the heart of soil health, then the soil texture is the bones, and the soil biota is the lifeblood pumping through the system, carrying the nutrients that the system needs to keep moving forward. But coming back to this diagram, I would also add this connection between the environment and agricultural practices, because the environment impacts the decisions like what to grow and when to go onto the field. Because these things are so interrelated, the connections could keep going, but I'm going to stop there for now. The other really wonderful thing about this diagram is that it shows the many ways that soil health impacts plants, farmers, and our society, which leads me to another point. Soil health is not permanent or
Lindsay, you
static.
keep cutting out,
Am I?
similar to
Maybe
me.
I'll
I don't
scoot closer.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but
Is this better?
keep
You're
talking.
doing good, Lindsay. I hear you. I think it's Heather's setup.
You think it's my computer? Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm hearing you fine,
Yeah,
Lindsay.
I'm hearing you fine.
Well, now that we've taken this moment for a break, am I speaking too quickly? Or is this an all right speed?
Fine.
Okay.
And
Cool.
great.
Good speed.
Okay. All right. I won't speed it up any faster then. All right. Coming back here. Thanks. We were just talking about that soil health isn't permanent and it's not static. It's a living system, so it can trend upwards with improved soil health, or soil health can decrease over time depending on management practices and also the weather. For example, adding fertility can stimulate soil biology, and warm weather can increase soil biological activity, that is the microbial populations. And these management practices and influence of the weather may influence soil test biological results. Soil health is a way to view the relationship with the land. Like a relationship, it requires care in order to give back. A soil that is healthy has a reciprocal relationship with its steward. The steward invests good management practices, and the soil reciprocates by supporting life, life that is the crops, the animals, and other benefits to our environment. So let's lean into those societal benefits a bit more. Processes that improve soil health contribute to many ecosystem services. Through carbon sequestration, soil can provide climate regulation. Through building of organic matter, it can improve nutrient cycling. Everyday lives, the ecosystem services we are most connected with from our soils are the provisioning of food, fiber, and fuel. And soil health can improve the sustainability of our soils to continue to produce those goods and provide other ecosystem services. So how can we manage our soils, keeping in mind their limitations, the environment's limitations, what the weather can bring or doesn't bring, and our own limitations, what resources we have available to fulfill the full potential of our soils, that potential of providing us food and all these ecosystem services? Seems like we are demanding a lot from the skin of the earth. And now I want to come back to bring it all together before moving on to soil testing. This diagram certainly isn't exhaustive, but I wanted to use it to illustrate the connections between soil health indicators, which are in blue, ecosystem services, which are in green, and types of management practices that impact soil health measurements and also ecosystem services in orange and brown. The main point here is that some indicators impact others, and that many indicators that are measured impact the same ecosystem services, and that the same management practices impact many soil health indicators and contribute to ecosystem service functioning. So in some ways, this also illustrates the importance of testing. For example, soil biota impacts nutrient cycling, and the tillage we use or the type of organic matter we add, whether that's dairy manure, poultry litter, or cover crops, can impact soil biota. We want to know which test is going to be most sensitive to picking up the soil biota changes that may result from our management practices. And there are many ways of measuring most of these indicators, and our speakers throughout the rest of the webinar series will present on some of them. Joshua Faulkner on some physical components, Deb Nair on some of the biotic components, and then Caitlin Hicks on different carbon fractions and soil health. So soil tests are really helpful because they measure different parts of the soil, and they also provide information that can help us to make a plan. And they can also help us assess what might be limiting soil functioning. What soil health tests don't do is directly measure crop productivity, which is a big reason we care about soil health. We want to make sure that our soil health is strong so that we can maintain or improve productivity. We want to sustain the resource that is our soil. Soil health tests also do not provide direct measurements of ecosystem services. For example, if our organic matter levels are high, that does relate to flood mitigation potential, but we can't directly measure how much of a mitigation that might be. Soil tests also don't prescribe actions that guarantee an increase in soil health. What we can say is that a certain indicator test is more sensitive to a particular change in management, but we can't ignore that there are also other factors that may impact that indicator and our soil health. So, why would we test our soil? It's important to think about the goals of soil testing, which may be different for different fields and on different farms or in different times throughout the year. Do you want to test to help understand what might be limiting your soil performance? Perhaps you're implementing or continuing a management practice and want to track changes over time. It's important to think about the relevance of the test. Does the test help you measure your progress or answer your question? This diagram depicts different problems that you may want to test for. For example, is erosion an issue on your farm? Is organic matter, fertility, or crop productivity decreasing? Are you interested in increasing soil biology or diversity to increase soil fertility and plant growth? Once you've tested and you get the test results back, you'll want to interpret them to understand what action to take. The practices you choose may improve the indicator you tested for and can also have wider reaching impacts of improving crop productivity, fertility, and other farm, environmental, and societal benefits. So let's talk about testing. One of the reasons we rely so much on the chemical aspects of soil health is because for such a long time, with the technology we had available, that was the thing we could measure about soil health. But now we can supplement our chemical understanding of soil health with other physical testing in the field and in the lab, and we can also supplement it with biological understanding of soil health, thanks to a lot of the technological advances as biological soil tests become more available and accessible. The diagram here depicts an analysis of different soil health assessments. There are indicator assessments for biological, physical, and chemical properties that touch on biodiversity, water quality, climate, and plant production. Most assessments include chemical analysis with varying degrees of inclusion of other category types of assessment. But I do want to pause here and acknowledge that there are ways of understanding the fertility of your soil besides chemical tests. Sometimes it shows up in nutrient deficiencies of your crops or the types of weeds present. But soil testing can be a proactive way to assess your soil before you plant or make changes to field management practices to best respond to what the soil needs and track changes over time. And with that, I think I will tap out and tag Heather in.
Okay, now I'm going to request the remote. And
So you got it
my,
there.
what's that?
Oh, so hopefully the remote went through.
So, yep, it says now I can control the screen. That was great, Lindsay. Thank you for that introduction to soil health. As we all know, it's very complex, diverse, and there's a lot more to learn, understand, know, as we try to sort of manage and improve the health of the soil on our farms. Lindsay and I were talking the other day and talking about soil health and, thinking about this a bit within the context of an individual farm or an individual kind of location in Vermont. And, what we were talking about is kind of like the genetic potential of the soil. And so each field, each farm, each situation has its own kind of soil health potential. And it's really important for us to understand the role that kind of context plays in determining our ability to manage for and promote soil health. So every situation is probably going to be really different. And that's what adds even more complexity to dealing with soil health. There's not always these broad brush recommendations or interpretations of the results. So over the last couple of decades, really, with this increasing interest in building soil health, along with that came testing soil health. How do we actually know if we have healthy soils, and if we're implementing practices or making changes, how do we know we're making improvements? And so there's been a lot of work, both in research and in building testing labs to bring soil health analytics to the farm. And this was a table that Lindsey put together with a number of us. Deb Neer, I believe, is on the call, and some other folks at UVM that were working on a soil health white paper to show some of the available labs and labs around our area and beyond that are offering soil health testing services, whether it's individual indicators or entire packages of soil health analytics. This area has grown quite considerably and continues to grow. So you can see all the different labs, and this was several years ago, and I imagine at this point there's even more labs that are offering different indicators of soil health. So what once seemed a little bit kind of abstract, maybe in some ways just a statement, now we can send samples from our farms or from our research plots into laboratories all across the country and have them send us back some results telling us if our soil's healthy or not. And this is really new, but again, it adds a lot of complexities and a lot more for us to understand. It's not just as easy as sending out a sample. And I see that somebody's asking for that white paper, and I will try to find the link. I saw Deb Neer was on here, so maybe she has it handy, but it was, I believe, published on ScholarWorks, so it is available. And we should update this as well. So let me go to my next slide here. Maybe. Oop. Going very slow. I don't know why. Okay. Now, one lab that will be added to this list in the coming year is the UVM, the new UVM Soil Health Research and Extension Center. So I know a lot of people have heard of this. There's been a few press releases. We've started to talk more about SHREC, which is our acronym, and really the new offerings that UVM will be able to offer the agricultural community and researchers related to soil health assessment. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about this, but Deb Neer and Joshua Faulkner have really been those at the heart of setting up the lab, and I'm sure they'll talk about this more during their presentations. But I wanted to give a quick intro to SHREC. Okay, so with all the emphasis in Vermont and really around us, around the region, on soil health and building resiliency on farms, we knew that it was time for us to be able to provide soil health testing at UVM. We needed to build that capacity in our lab and be able to offer this both to researchers, to extension, and of course to farmers. And that's exactly what we've been working on over the past, it's been over a year now, is getting this laboratory set up, which is a ton of work, way more than I could have ever imagined. Now, why do we want to yet kind of set up another lab that offers soil health services? You know, there's already a growing list of them, and we have a really great one very close to us. Cornell has their soil health lab. So why, why do we need one too? And what was really important to us is that we made sure that we had regionally relevant soil health, both research, testing services and interpretation, and a link to extension. So this is more a center with the lab, as part of it, but with more research and extension to help bring relevant soil health information and research out to our agricultural communities. All right, so let me go to the next slide. All right, so the lab is not open yet, and I'm sure Joshua and Deb will give more updates on this, but what I heard from Joshua last week at a meeting was that we will have some of the offerings probably late winter, early spring. It won't be everything on this list that you see, but some of these will be ready and available again, hopefully this coming year. So you can see the different offerings: soil respiration, micro PLFAs, aggregate stability, active carbon, ACE protein, some physical parameters, total carbon, etc. So, this has been a lot to get set up in the lab, and probably maybe what's going to be even bigger is interpretation, right? And as a scientist, we can get raw data back and we can interpret that. But as farmers, when we're giving farmers data back from the Shrek lab, we want to be able to make sure that it's meaningful, actionable, and that it makes sense for their farming system. So that is really some of what we'll be working on through the winter and, over time as well. So we did put up another poll. We just want to get a little feedback on some of the indicators that will be available at the Shrek Lab and those that you might be most interested in utilizing on your farm or in your work. All right. So more to come on that. Going really slow. There we go. All right, so now I want to get into some of the specifics around testing. And Lindsay already showed this slide. And I just wanted to bring it back up because with soil health testing, you need to really think about why you want to do it, right? What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish by learning more about the health of the soil through analytics, right? Through taking samples, sending them to a lab, and getting data back. What's your interest? Why? Why are you doing this? Now, we don't want to question the fact that you just want to have healthy soils and you just want to know more about soil health, but it's expensive, right? It costs quite a bit of money to run these analysis. And honestly, they may not all be useful for your operation or really for what question you're trying to answer or what you're trying to figure out. Okay, so you really need to think about your goals. Are you trying to understand a production limitation? Are you trying to understand a change in your management and if you're accomplishing better drainage, let's say? So really sit down and think about why you want to do testing. Okay, there's a lot we can accomplish and see and observe without sending in tests. And I think we want to work on that first and then think about analytics and why you want to use those. And having those goals will help us produce the most meaningful information for your farm. All right, so it looks like most people answered the poll. So I'm gonna go ahead and share those results. People can see. So again, setting goals. Sorry, it takes a long time for the slides to change. Can you change this? I might turn it back over to you, Lindsay. I don't know. I can't seem to get these to move.
Something's a little wonky. Maybe I still see that it's remote controlled. Maybe if you give it back and then take it back, it might fix it.
All right. So planning a soil health sampling plan, I guess is what I'll call it, really should start by setting these goals. Like, what is it that you're trying to accomplish here? What is it you want to measure? And now we can get into some of the more specifics if my slide will change. There we go.
Oh.
All right.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, that's fine. It's not your fault.
Is this the one you want to be
yeah.
on? Okay.
Yeah, this is the next one. So once you have some goals in mind, like I'm going to start adding compost to this field, or I want to subsoil this field, or I want to add diversity, and I want to see how that changes drainage, let's say. So once you have some goals in mind, you know what fields you want to look at, where you might be having problems, then we can kind of set up some sampling methods, select a lab, figure out how we're going to sample and when, right? So there's a lot to sampling. And again, it's garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. And without having a thoughtful process ahead of time, you may end up spending a lot of money and not getting the results that you want. If you could change the slide, oh, there we go. So we need to figure out the method of sampling and when we're going to do it and what kind of field conditions we're looking at. And again, it's not like chemical soil testing. I feel like there's a lot more considerations here to think about and a lot more details to pay attention to. So let's talk about a few of those. We can go to the next slide. Oop, back one. There we go. All right, so let's talk about when. So, generally we take standard soil tests most of the time in the fall, right? A lot of that's about convenience, timing, and, end of the season nutrient levels generally are drawn down. You take a sample in the fall, then you can plan through the winter on what you're going to do the next growing season. So there's a lot of good reasons to take a standard soil nutrient analysis sample in the fall. With soil health sampling, there's a lot of different times you could do this, okay? So you can collect samples before growing season activities. You can collect them throughout the growing season. You can collect them after harvest. Really, again, this is got to be focused on your goals. But regardless, what you want to do is make sure that soil moisture and temperature at the time of sampling are not in some extreme flux, right? We're not in the middle of a drought. We're not in the middle of a flood, let's say, that we're not in extremes. Now, I will dial back a little bit and say, maybe you want to measure the extremes, but in most cases, you can sample at most any time, depending on your goals. But again, you want to make sure the soil moisture and temperatures are, normal, whatever that is, I guess, at this point. And there haven't been a lot of recent physical disturbances or addition of soil amendments or other chemical inputs, right? So the time of the year maybe doesn't matter as much. It's more based on your goals and making sure that our conditions aren't in some extreme, all right? most of the time, we would recommend sampling prior to field activities, okay, at the beginning of a cropping cycle. And that's going to differ depending on what crops you're growing, so that you can minimize, any chance that the measurements you're trying to get a handle on are not going to be impacted by some field operation, okay? So generally, we would recommend that you would sample prior to major field activities, especially tillage, right? For most row crops in our climate, we prefer to sample in the spring prior to field operations, right? Prior to tillage, prior to planting. So going out there in the spring and doing our sampling. If you can't hit that timing, usually our second preferred timing is about 3 to 4 weeks after planting, giving the soil itself time to stabilize following that disturbance. So again, there's a lot of opportunities here, but when you actually go out and take those samples really will depend on your goals and your cropping system, but really trying to avoid some extremes. See if we can move. There we go. All right, so let's talk about protocols. So you see the protocol to the right. That is the protocol that most people are familiar with. And this is, a similar protocol to what the Cornell Soil Health Lab would use, where you go out with a sharpshooter shovel or a deep trowel, and you take these wedges of soils from various parts of the field, right? Well, depending on the lab you select and the analytics you want run, this may not be the protocol. So different labs have different sampling procedures, and some of the labs have different sampling procedures depending on the analytic. So, maybe as an example, if you're gonna, if you want PLFAs, you would sample with a regular soil probe, let's say to 2 inches, get it in the fridge immediately or freezer, and get it shipped out within 24 hours, right? Very specific protocol to follow. Where with the Cornell Soil Health Lab, you're using one protocol and getting all these different measurements. So again, depending on your goals and the analytic and the lab that you choose, you need to make sure that you read their sampling procedures and you follow those, okay? So they may require different sampling tools. You want to make sure you have those handy, because if you're not using the tool that's recommended, you may end up with these results that are difficult to interpret. You want to sample to the depth that is recommended. Again, the interpretation you're getting back from them is based on a standard sampling protocol. So you want to make sure that you're following that, from the tools that you use to, the depth that you sample, timing, and then handling, right? Be prepared to handle these samples differently than a standard nutrient analysis. Generally, these tests need to be stored, the samples need to be stored in a cooler or a refrigerator. They may need to be sent out immediately to get the best results. So the take-home message is read the directions, right? Do your homework and be ready. Next slide, please. Actually, I'm supposed to be really holding up my show here. So again, the tools. This is a great slide from New York Soil Health. They kind of show this sampling kit to get together. So before you head out and you have the directions in your hand, right? Oh, I'll read these when I get to the field. Read them before, read them at night, get all the things ready you need, and be prepared to go out and do efficient, accurate sampling that follows the directions. Okay, sample design. Now this looks pretty diverse over to the right here. There's a lot of different ways to sample for soil health. People will say, well, how many samples do I take in a field? And really, all of this depends on your goals. What is it, again, that you're trying to gain from doing the test? Do you just want an analysis of this field and you want to know what the health of it is? So then you would go out and do random sampling, right? Choosing locations along a W pattern, or maybe you lay a grid over the field and you go to random location within, every part of the grid. So that's one way to go about it, but that may not meet your goal, right? If your goal is to look at a problem in a field or multiple fields, you may have very distinct areas that you want to sample, right? So you really need to think about what you're trying to achieve here. It's not just going out in the field and taking random samples. You may not get the results you're looking for. Here, if you're trying to monitor change over time from a practice, you may want to use point sampling, right? Which is different than kind of random sampling or zone sampling. So zone sampling is, I would say, kind of commonly what we do, which is where you want to know the average soil property for a given area. And you may have different zones in a field. And so the zone sampling will give you a result that represents a bigger area. If you're trying to go back and look at changes in soil health over time, you may actually want to do point sampling, which is where you go to a specific area and you GPS that area basically so that you can go back to that same point and take a sample 3 years from now, right? Because you are really focused on a particular practice, let's say, or a very specific part of that field, or a specific environmental factor. So again, you have to know why to be able to understand how to best go out in that field and take a soil health sample. And of course, there's plenty of us available to help you figure that out. All right, let's see if I can get to the next slide here. All right. So if you are, and many of us do want to measure soil health over time, right? So maybe you have a field that you're experimenting in and you want a baseline sample, and then you want to go back and measure to see if what you're doing is making a difference. Are you improving soil health or not? And you have a set of very specific indicators that you're looking at. In this case, you probably want to try to go back to the same point, right? You want to use point sampling and try to go back to some georeference location. And then once you're back there, you want to use the same exact sampling strategy. You don't want to sample 6 inches with a shovel and then the next time go out and sample to a foot with a 1-inch probe, right? Then you want to also try to collect under similar soil conditions, because these indicators are very sensitive to environmental conditions. So too wet, too dry, like I said before. So you want to try to have similar conditions. You want to try to go back to that same spot. You want to use the same sampling strategy. Try to collect at the same time of the year. And then, most importantly, you want to use the same lab and those tests and those methods, right? And that's important because we know from chemical testing that labs do things differently. And this is a nice image that I borrowed from the New Jersey RC&D that show a bunch of different labs and a bunch of different tests and how they give different results. So it is important for interpretation and to see if you're making a difference over time, to use consistency in sampling, lab, methods, etc. I'm running out of time here. All right, so let's talk briefly about interpreting the results. And we're going to hear a lot more about this, not just the indicators, but what they mean, and a little bit about how we can manage for them. But interpreting results, soil health results, can be very complex. And so having goals and focusing, your measurements and what you select is really important, because that's all going to help in the interpretation stage. So, if you're somebody working with the farm and you go out and you take these soil health tests and you get them back and you're just staring at them and you can't figure out what's going on, this is where having knowledge outside of that piece of paper is really important. And when I say knowledge, it's knowledge of the landscape, the geology, the texture of the soil, the management that's been used. If you were the one that took the samples, what was the weather conditions like? Because you're going to need all of that information to help interpret these soil health tests, and make them usable and make sense to the farmer or to anyone else. So this is a process that our team and our soil cohorts have gone through in nauseam. I feel like we spent an entire summer trying to interpret soil health tests from these farms. And it was fascinating. And what we realized was, it doesn't always make sense, but it will make the most sense if you have all the external information you need and you know what you're trying to achieve. Like, what was your goal in the first place? All right. We have another poll up talking or asking you what would be the most useful information that you could get on a soil health report. So your feedback here is really important as we're in these stages of developing the output. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about limitations. I've kind of gone through these directly and indirectly. There's a lot to soil health testing, a lot of details here. We need to have some focused goals, objectives to go out and do this, because it's expensive. There's nothing cheap about soil health testing, okay, and sending these into labs. So we want to make it worth everybody's time. We want to get something out of this that's going to be helpful to the farm and help either document that we have arrived or if we've made change, are we doing better, etc. It does take time, just like any other soil testing, takes labor, and in some cases, a little bit of new knowledge, some new skills to make sure that we're taking the samples properly. All right. So again, interpretation here is something we'll get into more, during the presentations, but this requires a lot of effort to interpret and to understand and figure out, how to utilize these on the farm. All right. So I want to go back to kind of the beginning when we were talking about, these indicators. And, do we really need to test? And I think in some cases, having the test and the analytics can be very, very helpful from an educational standpoint, from a standpoint of we want to make improvements, we know what we want to do, but these tests do not replace your own observations and your own going out into that field or onto that farm, or working with the farmer, or if you're a farmer, going out and looking yourself. There is a lot that you can understand about the health of your soil without sending it into a lab. And we need to start there. And from there, building some goals and objectives if we want to move to the analytical part. So I just want to walk through this briefly because I think, at the end of the day, these things are for free, and they're going to tell you a lot about where you're at with the health of your soil. So none of these are new information. There's a lot of things you can see above ground when you walk out into fields. And these are annual crop pictures, but just looking at cover. Is the ground covered? If it's annual crops, is there residue? And actually, even if it's perennial crops, do you see bare soil? What kind of organic matter and litter is on the surface of the soil? Okay, because we know we want to protect the surface. So we need protection on the surface, but we also know that we want to feed the microbial population. So we also need litter and cover to feed microbes. So if you go out into the field and it's completely bare and there's nothing there, that's not good, right? So this is a simple observation that can be made. Residue decomposition. Again, if you can see the corn stover out in a field, and that field hasn't been in corn for 3 or 4 years, there's a problem, right? That residue should be decomposing relatively quickly if it's a biologically active and healthy soil. So again, above ground observations, really simple things, but you have to take the time to do it and then really sort of connect the dots, right? So you see this wheat and you see this soybean and you see corn. You see 3 years worth of crop material here. If that corn was 3 years ago, that should be gone. Okay, so that should draw up some flags, some red flags. Crusting, right? If you can go out into a field and dig your hands into it, no matter what time of the year, that's great. If you go out into a field and that soil is rock hard, not good, right? If you can't dig into it with your hands easily, you can't take a knife and dig into it, and you got to resort to a shovel or a jackhammer to get down in there, that's a problem, right? Probably not too healthy. Probably maybe some ponded water, some poor soil structure, etc. So really simple things that you can look for, again, before you get a measurement to tell you this is poor aggregate stability. Well, I can already see that. I don't need to spend $85 to figure it out. Ponding in fields, right? You start seeing this in different parts of the field, probably have some compaction, probably have poor drainage, probably have poor structure. These are all things you can observe before you head out and start sending in lab tests. You can do these infiltration tests to see if the field will pond. It's a little more complicated, but I've even seen these measurements where you put a probe in the ground and dump water in it and see if it'll absorb into the soil. So lots of ways to assess the soil. I'm running out of time here. Looking at the roots, right? Super easy. How do they look? Are they growing vigorously? Are there a lot of them? Are they covered in rhizosheaths like you see to the left? In the middle, you see that it's growing sideways, probably not good. What do the roots look like? That's a simple thing to do. You can get a penetrometer, although honestly, it's not really needed because you can dig out some soil and look at how it breaks apart in your hand. Is it platy? Is it a brick? Or does it just fall apart in your hands? All of these are just visual, easy indicators to know what's going on, right? So get your shovel out, dig that wedge like you were going to send it in for a soil health analysis and take a look. You can easily see where roots stop growing, what direction they're moving, what's the structure of the soil, how does it smell, what's the color. So before we move to analytics, make sure you're making these observations and that the money you spend on testing is well spent. All right. So I'm gonna wrap up with that. I thought this was cool too, just the future of soil health monitoring. A lot of technology out there, pretty exciting stuff, but yeah, in the future. All right, well, I will end with that today, and we do have, I think there's another poll. Has that been put in there? I'm not sure. What I wanted to end on, but we've run out of time, is that there are a lot of resources for soil health testing and implementation of practices that can help build soil health once we've done some assessment. And a lot of that is through the USDA and NRCS. And I know most people are familiar with NRCS on this call, and they have some great programs and funding to help fund soil health practices, as well as planning and assessment. So we would recommend that you contact NRCS if you're interested in, receiving some funding to help implement practices, monitoring, etc. All right. All right. So anything else we need to cover today, Lindsay? I think there we go. So Susan, oh, there. Yep. One last thing, if you would like a CCA credit, there's one available. And we would love for you to join us for the rest of the webinar series that will be focused on analytics, testing, and the indicators of soil health. So please join us tomorrow, same time. And we'll be talking about physical properties with Dr. Joshua Faulkner. I gotta get my QR code scanner out here. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. I'm gonna end the poll here. Share the poll. All right. We look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Susan, could you put the CCA QR code back up? There. Okay, good now. Right.